miasma of filth, medieval cities, and the stench of death. When we imagine the medieval city, we might picture spires of cathedrals piercing the sky, bustling marketplaces filled with merchants and color, knights on horseback clattering over cobbled streets. But beneath the ringing of church bells and the cries of hawkers lay another, darker truth. A truth that assaulted not the eyes, but the nose. The medieval city was a world drenched in filth, a labyrinth of refuse, decay, and unwashed humanity, where the very air itself seemed poisonous. The medieval city stank. It stank of sweat, of animals, of dung and rotting food, of stagnant water and unwashed bodies. It stank of death. For those who lived there, the stench was inescapable. From the moment you entered the city gates, the smells rushed to greet you like an unwelcome host. Roads, if they could be called that, were often little more than rutted tracks of mud and excrement. Horses pulled carts through them, leaving behind steaming piles of dung. Pigs, the medieval city's natural scavengers, wandered freely through the streets, rooting in the muck for scraps, and adding their own droppings to the mire. Chickens darted about, geese squawked, and stray dogs nosed through refuse. Everything excreted, and everything stayed. There was nowhere for it to go. Human waste was everywhere. Most houses did not have privies, only chamber pots. At night, the contents of those pots were flung into the street with a careless cry, "Gardaloo!" In some towns, or simply nothing at all. Windows opened, and out went the filth. It splashed onto the cobbles, into the open gutters, sometimes onto unfortunate passers-by. The narrow alleys of Paris, London, or Cologne reeked constantly of fresh ordure. The gutters themselves were little open sewers, running sluggishly through the heart of the streets, carrying away whatever refuse people tossed into them, when they carried it at all. In dry weather, the muck baked into a crust, releasing a choking odor. In rain, it became a foul slurry that splashed up onto clothes and faces. Shoes, if one had them, sank deep into the ooze. Rotting food added to the stew. Medieval markets sold meat that often hung for days unrefrigerated, its smell masked with herbs and spices. Fish, carried long distances without ice, spoiled quickly. What could not be sold was thrown into the street to rot. Bones, skins, entrails, all were tossed out of butchers' shops. Offal piled up in corners where stray dogs fought over it, spreading the stench of blood and decay. Rats scurried freely, thriving in the endless abundance of waste. No one could escape them. They ran along rafters, skittered across cobbles, and gnawed their way into storerooms. Their fleas carried invisible killers. The smell of tanneries and dye works was perhaps the most unbearable of all. Leather was softened in vats of urine, sometimes mixed with dog dung or quicklime. Workers stirred the hides with bare arms, their clothes soaked with the reek. Tanneries were often located on the edges of towns, yet the wind carried their stench far and wide. Dyers, meanwhile, used foul-smelling substances to fix their colors: rotting plants, fish oils, stale urine. Soap makers boiled animal fats, releasing greasy, choking fumes. To walk past these workshops was to gag. But for those who worked there daily, the smells clung to them like a second skin. Even sacred spaces were not spared. Churchyards, overfilled with bodies, leaked their odor into the streets. Graves were shallow, packed tightly, and disturbed by new burials. In some places, bones and corpses rose up from the earth after heavy rains, spilling into the open. Parishioners knelt in churches heavy with incense, but outside, the wind brought with it the unmistakable reek of death. The city was a cemetery with walls. And then there were the people themselves. Bathing was rare, and for much of the medieval period, water was viewed with suspicion, thought to open the pores to disease. Soap was expensive, perfumes a luxury. Most people washed only their hands and faces, if at all. Clothes were worn until they reeked, then brushed or beaten, but seldom laundered. In summer heat, bodies sweltered and sweated. Lice and fleas thrived in hair and clothing. The breath of thousands of unwashed mouths mingled with the smells of urine, dung, and rotting food to create an atmosphere that clung to every building, every market, every home. To walk through a crowded medieval street was to breathe inhumanity in its rawest form. Medical theory, such as it was, gave a name to this oppressive stench. Miasma. The bad air that arose from rotting matter, from stagnant water, from filth of all kinds, was believed to cause disease. And in this, medieval thinkers were not entirely wrong. While it was not the air itself but the fleas on rats, the bacteria in spoiled food, or the parasites in dirty water, the connection between filth and sickness was undeniable. Outbreaks of plague, dysentery, and typhoid followed in the wake of poor sanitation. The smell of the city was not just offensive, it was deadly. Imagine, then, the terror when plague came. Already accustomed to foul air, people now feared every whiff of corruption as a breath of death. The stench of bodies piled in plague pits was overwhelming. Houses were sealed shut, and inside, the dead and dying lay together, filling the air with the odor of decay. Fires were lit in the streets, and herbs were burned in a desperate attempt to purify the air. Doctors carried posies or wore beaked masks stuffed with spices and vinegar-soaked cloths, not to block infection as we now know, but to ward off the evil smell. The city became an olfactory battlefield, with death carried not only in bodies but in the very atmosphere. But long before plague, the smells shaped daily life. Waste collection became a profession in many cities. The night soil men crept through the streets, shoveling human excrement from cesspits, carting it outside the walls to be dumped or spread on fields. The work was degrading, but it paid. Rakers cleaned the gutters, sometimes piling the refuse into carts to be hauled away. Yet for every load taken out, another was dumped in. The sheer volume of waste in a medieval city was staggering, and the workers could never keep pace. In the heat of summer, the air grew thick with the smell of rot. Flies swarmed over everything: food stalls, wounds, corpses. In winter, the stink froze, only to return with renewed vigor in the thaw. The people adapted. They burned incense, scattered herbs on their floors, and hung sweet-smelling garlands in their homes. In wealthier houses, rushes or straw on the floor were replaced often, sprinkled with flowers or spices. But beneath the perfumes, the truth remained. Filth was everywhere, and no amount of rosemary or lavender could mask it for long. The stench was not confined to the poor. Even in castles, with their grand halls and stone walls, the air was thick with the smell of humanity. Rushes on the floors collected food scraps, grease, and urine from dogs and servants. Privies emptied into cesspits or straight into moats, which themselves became stagnant, bubbling with the foulest odors. Royal courts might wear silks and jewels, but their noses were not spared from the reality of medieval life. Travelers from cleaner lands were shocked. Visitors from the East often remarked on the filth of European towns. Arab chroniclers, accustomed to the comparatively sanitary practices of Islamic cities with their bathhouses and sewage systems, described the stinking alleys of Christian Europe with disgust. To them, the so-called centers of Christendom were little more than dung heaps. And they were not entirely wrong. The smell shaped more than health, it shaped culture. Fear of foul air influenced architecture, with houses built narrow and tall, crowding into each other, shutting out wind. Windows were few and small, keeping out not only light but also the supposed miasma. People clung to talismans, charms, and scents as protection. Festivals and processions filled the air with incense and smoke. Acts of devotion doubled as efforts to cover the stink. And always, beneath it all, was death. Death in the streets, death in the markets, death in the very air. To live in a medieval city was to breathe corruption daily. The perfume of flowers in spring mixed with the stench of carrion. The incense of holy mass fought with the stink of open graves. Every breath was a reminder of mortality. This was the miasma of filth. Not just the literal air, but the atmosphere of medieval urban life itself. It was a world where the senses were assaulted daily, where disease lurked in every foul odor, where the city itself seemed alive with its own stinking breath. To step into a medieval town was to step into a world of filth and death, a world where the line between life and rot was paper thin. And yet, within this reek, people lived, loved, and built the foundations of the modern world. They endured because they had no choice. When we think of medieval times, we must remember not just the knights and castles, but the gutters and cesspits. Not just the cathedrals, but the stink of their crowded churchyards. Not just the markets filled with color and sound, but the reek of spoiled meat and animal dung. The medieval city was not just a place of wonder. It was a place of stench. And in that stench lay the constant reminder of human fragility, of mortality, of death forever lurking in the very air they breathed.